Before I start, a content warning. This episode contains some gruesome descriptions of death. The first thing they noticed was the smell, like someone frying rancid lamb chops. The two men sat in their flat in London and chatted uneasily about their midnight appointment with old Mr. Crook, whose shop was downstairs. But ominous sights and smells kept interrupting them. Black soot swirled around the room like the devil's dandruff. It stained one man's sleeves. And when the other man leaned on the windowsill, his hands came away streaked with yellow grease. "Give me some water," he cried, "or I'll cut off my hands." Midnight finally struck, and they descended the stairs. Mr. Crook's shop was crammed with bottles, rags, and other hoarded trash. Walking through it was unpleasant even in the daytime. That night, they sensed something positively evil. They clung to each other as they crept along. Crook lived in the back of the shop, and outside his bedroom door, a black cat leapt out and hissed. When they entered Crook's room, the odor choked them. Grease stained the walls and ceilings as if painted on. They squinted and saw Crook's coat and cap on a chair. A bottle of gin sat on the table. But the only sign of life was the cat, still hissing. They swung their lantern around, searching for Crook. They finally spied a pile of ash on the floor. They stared stupidly for a moment, before turning and running. They burst into the street and shouted, "Help! Help!" But it was too late. Old Mr. Crook was gone, a victim of spontaneous combustion. Charles Dickens penned this scene in December 1852, an excerpt from his novel Bleak House. And most readers swallowed the story completely. After all, Dickens wrote realistic stories, and he took great pains to render scientific matters accurately. His observations on smallpox and neurological disorders are as acute as any doctor's. So even though Crook was fictional, the public trusted that Dickens had portrayed spontaneous combustion with precision. But a few readers heard about Crook's death and began burning up themselves, in rage. Scientists then were laboring to debunk old nonsense like clairvoyance, mesmerism, and the idea that people sometimes burst into flames for no reason. And recent discoveries about heat and metabolism had provided strong support for their views. They proved that the human body, far from being removed from nature, was subject to strict laws. But enough mysteries remained for old wives' tales to flourish about things like spontaneous combustion. This only made both sides more desperate to prove their case. And within 2 weeks of Dickens publishing this chapter, skeptics began challenging him in print, igniting one of the strangest controversies in literary history. From the Science History Institute, this is Sam Keene and the Disappearing Spoon, a topsy-turvy, science-y history podcast, where footnotes become the real story. The man who led the charge against Charles Dickens in spontaneous combustion was George Lewis. Lewis came from a line of actors, and he had a foot in the literary world. He was a critic and playwright, and was novelist George Eliot's longtime lover. Later in life, Lewis would pioneer the study of the unconscious mind. He also studied physiology as a young man, so he understood the body well. And he served as a sort of Victorian Richard Dawkins, always ready to attack superstition. Lewis first met Dickens at age 20. Dickens was 5 years older. They ran in the same circles, and they once acted together on stage in a benefit for a Shakespeare theater. Lewis played a part from Merry Wives of Windsor. Overall, Lewis counted Dickens as a friend. Not that you would know that from Lewis's response to Bleak House. After reading about Mr. Crook's death via spontaneous combustion, Lewis began fuming, and he wrote a column attacking the chapter. In it, he acknowledged that artists have a license to bend the truth, but he protested that they just can't ignore laws of physics. As he wrote, these circumstances are beyond the limits of acceptable fiction, and they give credence to a scientific impossibility. He furthermore accused Dickens of cheap sensationalism and of, quote, giving currency to a vulgar error. Dickens was miffed. He had always had an ambivalent relationship with science. He couldn't deny the marvels that science wrought, He also had famous scientists for friends, like anatomist Richard Owen and the pioneering computer scientist Charles Babbage. Both formed the basis for characters in his books. But Dickens was fundamentally romantic at heart. He thought that science killed imagination and undermined Christian society. He detested the growing dependence on data and reductionism as well. So when Lewis attacked Dickens, Dickens swung right back. He published Bleak House serially as installments in a monthly magazine, so he had time to slip a rebuttal to Lewis into the January issue. The novel's action picks up with the inquest into Crook's death, and the narration mocks critics of spontaneous combustion as eggheads who are too blind to see plain evidence. As Dickens wrote, some of these authorities, of course the wisest, hold that the deceased had no business to die in the alleged manner. To them, going out of the world by any such byway was wholly unjustifiable and personally offensive. But according to Dickens, common sense eventually triumphs. The coroner in the story declares, "These are mysteries we cannot account for." In letters to Lewis, Dickens continued his campaign. He claimed to have looked into the matter as thoroughly as a judge would have, and he found 30 cases overall. He leaned especially hard on the case of an Italian countess who combusted in 1731. The woman reportedly bathed in spirits of wine infused with camphor, possibly for her skin. The morning after one bath, her maid walked into her room and found the bed unslept on. As with Mr. Crook, soot hung suspended in the Countess's chamber, along with a yellow haze of oil. The maid found the Countess's legs, just her legs, standing several feet from the bed. A pile of ashes sat between them, along with 3 fingers and her skull. Nothing else seemed amiss, except for 2 candles. The tallow had melted, but the cotton wick lay there unburned. A priest had recorded this tale, so Dickens considered it trustworthy. Nor was he the only author to believe in spontaneous combustion. Mark Twain, Washington Irving, and Herman Melville all had characters combust as well. Melville's depiction was especially vivid. In it, 2 sailors drag a shipmate onto a boat. The man is dead drunk, and they leave him to sleep it off. A while later, they smell something foul, a dead rat, they fear. In hunting the odor down, they're led back to the drunk sailor. All of a sudden, the man erupts in fire. Melville describes how his cadaverous face was crawled over by a swarm of worm-like flames, flames that are a lurid green. The man also has a white tattoo that shimmers beneath the green blaze. These literary scenes have certain elements in common. They usually involve old, sedentary alcoholics. Dickens's Mr. Crook drank gin by the barrel. During the actual combustion, people were consumed alarmingly quickly. Their torsos always burned completely, but their extremities sometimes survived. Eeriest of all, beyond the occasional scorch mark somewhere, the flames never consumed anything but the victims' bodies. Afterward, foul odors and choking fumes pervaded the scene, along with soot and yellow grease. The scenes are similar in part because the authors drew on the same sources for their material: magazine stories, medical accounts, and legal texts. According to such authorities, gin was the booze most likely to produce spontaneous burning, followed by brandy and whiskey. Rum, for some reason, was safer. Preachers also used spontaneous combustion to rail against the evils of drinking. After all, can you imagine a more vivid depiction of hellfire than somebody's body going up in flames? Believe it or not, Dickens and those other authors had some science backing them up here. Dickens wrote Bleak House within a decade of the discovery of nitroglycerin, an explosive oil that can indeed detonate spontaneously. More significantly, spontaneous combustion seemed linked with one of the most important discoveries in medical history, involving deep connections between combustion, blood, and breathing. In 1628, the English doctor William Harvey provided the first modern evidence that blood flows around the body in a circuit, with the heart acting as a pump. Most people before this assumed that the liver converted food into blood, and that our organs drank blood like plants do water. At the same time, Harvey got some things wrong. He knew that both blood and air passed through the lungs, but he insisted that the two did not mix there. Instead, he thought that the lungs merely cooled the blood by waving back and forth, like a fan. He insisted that the lungs did not alter the blood chemically. Later, in the 1660s, two other scientists proved that idea wrong. They showed this through a series of blood-curdling experiments. These experiments involved dissecting animals and using a bellows as an artificial lung. The scientists observed that the organs seemed to function as long as air streamed through the lungs. From this, they concluded that the motion of the lungs meant nothing. Instead, we now know that the lungs trigger chemical changes in the blood. Then, chemists in the late 1700s got more specific. They determined that the lungs took in oxygen, which dissolves into the blood. The blood simultaneously released carbon dioxide, which the lungs expel. When oxygen enters the blood, it slips inside red blood cells and latches onto hemoglobin molecules. Blood cells then carry that gas to tissues inside the body. At that same time, the late 1700s, chemists were also investigating the role of oxygen in fire. They determined that oxygen is vital for combustion. Oxygen supplies the energy that makes fires burn. And they realized that oxygen might play a similar role in the body during metabolism. To be sure, these scientists did not get everything right. They believed that the combustion of metabolism took place in the lungs. Blood then merely carried that energy to cells. Not until the 1870s did they realize that that's mistaken. Cells and tissues actually burn oxygen inside themselves. That's where combustion metabolism takes place. Still, by the mid-1800s, scientists had the overall idea right. Our lungs take in oxygen for fuel. And the burning of that fuel induces a sort of slow combustion, a constant burning inside us. And as Dickens and others argued, if slow fires were perpetually burning inside us, why couldn't they suddenly flare up sometimes?
I'm Mark Pimenta, host of the Warlords of History podcast, a show that follows the lifetimes of ancient and medieval military leaders, figures who shook the very foundations of the eras in which they lived, fought, and died, amid swirling social and political forces, igniting audacious campaigns, monumental battles, empires created and destroyed, carving their names into history. Join me as we dive into each of their stories, their worlds, in the Warlords of History podcast, or visit warlordsofhistory.com.
Scientists had proved that low fires were constantly burning inside us, and maybe the fires flared up sometimes. Such flare-ups seemed especially likely in alcoholics, whose very organs were dripping with gin or brandy. As for what sets off a spontaneous fire, perhaps fevers did, or raging hot tempers. Overall, in defending spontaneous combustion, Dickens was throwing more fuel onto a smoldering scientific debate. As one historian noted, it was an exciting and confusing period. Lurid sensationalists, as well as serious scientists, both wrote about spontaneous human combustion, and both took the matter seriously. George Lewis, however, the Richard Dawkins of his day, was having none of this. Again, Dickens had cited historical sources that mention spontaneous combustion, but Lewis dismissed Dickens' sources as, quote, humorous, but not convincing. Lewis noted that several were over a century old. He also pointed out that none of the accounts were written by eyewitnesses. The author had always heard the story secondhand from a cousin's friend or a landlord's brother-in-law. It didn't help that Dickens had also cited the support of a celebrity doctor who promoted phrenology as well. Most damning of all, Lewis cited evidence against spontaneous combustion from recent experiments in physiology. These experiments revealed that the liver metabolizes booze and breaks it down. As a result, our organs aren't soaking in a flammable substance. More evidence came from Justus von Liebig. I've mentioned Liebig before on the podcast, the German chemist who tried to make artificial breast milk, the so-called deadly soup for babies. Liebig cast doubt on spontaneous combustion by pointing out that our bodies are something like 75% water, far too wet to burn. Liebig even ran experiments where he tried to burn cadaver organs. They would not ignite without external fuel. As Lewis gleefully pointed out to Dickens, this undermines the whole premise of spontaneous human combustion. Not surprisingly, Dickens dug in his heels and again cited those historical cases. Unfortunately, Dickens did not seem to grasp that eyewitness accounts about spontaneous combustion and scientific experiments on spontaneous combustion were not equally reliable evidence. As a result, he continued to insist on the reality of humans suddenly lighting on fire. This was not all stubbornness, though. It reflected a fundamentally different view of what science should mean to humans. As one critic put it, for Dickens, empirical science merely corroborates what the heart already knows. Artistically, too, Dickens considered the scene in Bleak House with Mr. Crook burning up to be central to the novel's theme. The story involves a ruinous court case that consumes the lives and fortunes of everyone involved. Crook's death was a potent symbol of that, and Dickens could not stand his metaphor being picked apart. And the more defensive Dickens got, the more disgusted Lewis felt. They continued to bicker for 10 months, until the final magazine installment of Bleak House appeared in September 1853. After that, when the novel appeared in book form, Lewis begged Dickens to put a notice in the preface admitting the error. The very idea offended Dickens. Eventually, both disgusted, they mutually dropped the matter. History, of course, has judged Lewis the winner here. Outside of supermarket tabloids, no human being has ever spontaneously combusted. And while there are some mysterious modern cases of human beings burning up, there are far more likely explanations, however morbid. In every known case, open flames were burning near the person. Also, a flammable liquid like alcohol was often on hand. In all likelihood, the person died of a stroke or a heart attack and simply caught fire. The parts of the body that got left behind were spared because they lack fat and may not have been covered in clothing, which is often flammable. But these realizations require modern understanding. Back in Dickens's time, the idea wasn't quite as ridiculous as it seems now. One medical text was still discussing spontaneous combustion as late as 1928. Plus, Dickens was undeniably right about one thing, that in human affairs, spontaneous combustion can happen. Friendships and reputations can ignite instantly and consume themselves in smoke and ashes. Dickens and Lewis eventually patched things up, but for those 10 months in London in 1853, the fires of resentment and umbrage burned awfully hot. This is the Disappearing Spoon podcast, brought to you by the Science History Institute. Be sure to check out their in-depth science history podcast, Distillations. You can find it anywhere you get your podcasts, or on their website, distillations.org. You can find more incredible stories in my books or at samkeen.com. You can also book me as a speaker there for your school or event. If you like this podcast, please spread the word and support it at patreon.com/disappearingspoon. You can also get bonus episodes and signed books at Patreon. This episode was written by me, Sam Keen. It was produced by Mariel Carr, Rigoberto Hernandez, and Sarah Kaplan. Our sound design, scoring, and mixing is by Justin Berger of Row Home Productions. Row Home's creative director is Alex Lewis. John Myers is Row Home's executive producer. Thanks for listening.
Row Home Productions.
Have you ever wondered why onions make you cry?
Or how soap gets your hands clean?
What really is margarine?
Or why do trees change color in the fall?
I'm a chemist, and to answer these questions, I started a podcast called Chemistry for Your Life.
In each episode, Melissa explains the chemistry behind one of life's mysteries to me. And I'm definitely not a chemist, but she explains it in a way that's easy to understand and totally fascinating.
If you're someone who loves learning new things or who wonders about the way the world works, then check out Chemistry for Your Life, available wherever you listen to podcasts.